Hi there. My name is David Yun, and I've built this podcast for all of us photographers looking for some extra inspiration. Every Friday, I interview local photographers about the how and the why behind their projects, and at the end of each episode, I add a thought or a challenge for both of us to consider as we continue our pursuit of awesome photography. You can help me keep this project growing by sharing this podcast with your photo-loving friends and by subscribing and leaving a review or a rating on your podcast platform of choice. Ultimately, the goal is to stir up conversation and thoughtfulness about photography as a practice, and I wanted to start each episode with a thank you. Your attention and focus on these artists and these conversations help the community at large keep growing. So, without further ado, welcome to my viewfinder. So how are you? Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. So what did you get into? Like, how did you start this podcast? I've been listening for a little while actually. So when you reached out, it was like, oh my god, yes.
I don't know, existential crisis. I think this photography venture is my midlife crisis. So I've been just doing what I can for a couple years, and then it's not really this asshole's fault, but I think I was just burning out a little bit, and then I was on a street shoot with a friend, and we were confronted by an angry racist, and
oh shit.
Yeah, and this is pre-COVID, and we just, I don't know, it got me thinking about why I'm even out there. Not in like I don't want to be confronted way, although nobody likes being confronted, but I was at a talk with George Weber, and he, a couple years ago, and he said something along the lines of the key to documentary photography and street photography is, we are afforded rights in the charter to be able to be out in public, but he's like, the moral question is, am I trying to show my subject in their best light?
Fair enough. And I when I'm listening to the podcast, like I always do, like there's little sprinkles of it in some of your questions where I do get the sense that you're kind of like trying to explore your craft a little bit through these conversations, because it seems like you're in a little bit of like I don't know what I'm doing out there, kind of like it seemed like you had a bit of a point of crisis almost, where I was like, dude, like, yeah, so that actually shed a lot of light on it. And this is gonna be kind of weird for me, because as a journalist, I'm used to being the one who's asking questions.
You can ask questions.
rather than having questions asked of me. It's funny that you mentioned George Weber too, because he's a big inspiration of mine. I feel like maybe we went to the same talk, or he always brings up these points at his talks, because this is a point that he usually tends to make. George has the privilege of being, he has privilege, right? He's a white male Canadian, so he can, he can often gain access to some communities where other races might not be welcome, or things like that. So and actually some of his talks is why I'm going into a master's program on cultural studies, basically to explore kind of like the ethics of visual ethnography, like are people's stories that you see on the street, like is that our stories to tell? Where do we fit in with that? Why are you taking these photos? Are you showing that person in their best possible light? Do you need to show that person in their best possible light? As a journalist, no. You don't always need to show somebody in their best possible light, especially if you try to speak truth to power. But if you're feeling vulnerable groups, maybe not. Really, there's no answers to any of these questions, really. We're all just kind of fumbling around in the dark, trying to do it the best that we can and trying to be as ethical as possible. Some people trouble themselves with these questions, I think, more than others. I definitely have gotten into some keyboard wars online with some Associated Press photographers where, oh God, what did this guy say? So there was this scenario in the States recently where they're doing a lot of land back action. The indigenous communities are doing a lot of land back action protests. And this one photographer was he was well within his rights to take this photo from a legal standpoint, right? So, just kind of like you with that street photography picture, like, you're on the street, kind of everything's fair game within our legal system. But he took a picture of these two people hugging as there's something burning behind them as the police swept in and removed this land back action. So there was like a bit of a tiff in his Instagram about, there were some people saying like this photographer wasn't respectful, the elders asked him not to take photos, and he did anyway. And then there was other people defending him saying, oh no, he was really respectful, he talked to the elders. So, really, it was kind of a toss-up as to like what exactly happened unless we're really there. But then there was like a comment, like in a discussion in a form of photojournalist with this photographer, like, hey, like, have you guys had this happen? And like, I've had the cops called on me before, taking photos down in Calgary for some projects when I was in Mount Royal University, their journalism program. And I was perfectly within my right to be there, and the cops agreed, but you still have the cops called on you. And one of the Associated Press photographers, who is a documentary photojournalist, who, by all rights really needs to build trust with the people he photographs, you would think. And I was like, look, this is my experience as a documentary photographer. You need to build trust your subjects. Like, it's always not necessarily about following the law. Sometimes it's about ethics, right? Like, these people are vulnerable groups. Do you take that photo? Do you, talk to the people afterwards and before? It's a little more complicated than that. And the guy responded really, really, it was like, you're a photojournalist, you don't need to go out there and hand out hand jobs. You just go out there and take your photo. And I'm like, dude, like, what? Like, you're a documentary photographer, man. Like, you need to go and make sure you establish trust with your subjects. Like, this is a lot of the reason why colonial media and, it's such a difficult thing in reconciliation, because there's a lot of deteriorated trust there. So yeah, within our laws, we're able to do it, but should you? Should you have some extra steps in there to make sure that everything's, you're not really trying to speak truth to power to these people, it's to the establishment taking those down, right? So a lot of these things open up those kinds of questions.
My Viewfinder is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, locally grown, community supported. The Alberta Podcast Network is a program to support Albertan podcasts by connecting us with local businesses and initiatives to keep our stories and our interests at the fore. If you're interested in finding more Albertan podcast content in a wide range of topics, check out their website, albertapodcastnetwork.com, or you can connect with them over social media. They are at AlbertaPodNet on both Instagram and Twitter. Our first message comes from PodPower. With PodPower, our sponsors are making it possible for us to amplify the voices of Albertans and Alberta podcasters. For this episode, Edmonton Community Foundation is helping us to give a PodPower shout-out to Overdue Finds. Overdue Finds is an Edmonton Public Library podcast. Bryce Crittenden and Caroline Land host conversations about books, movies, music, pop culture, and other interesting news about Edmonton. It's a great way to learn more about what's happening at EPL and about how you can use your library card to access all of EPL's in-person and online services. To listen and find out more about Overdue Finds, head to epl.ca/podcast. This week, I sit down with Stefan Strangman, writer and freelance photojournalist. I wanted to find out how journalism is taught and practiced, to challenge my own cynical bias that it's just twisted by its very nature. Stefan shares with me how he became a journalist and how his own practice centers around a strong sense of ethics and personal beliefs. He explains that both through his education and work experience, he's become very aware of the impact photography can have on public opinion and understanding. He also understands that the ability and responsibility to share stories is changing, it's evolving. It's not just the privilege and the establishment that should endeavor to create stories. We're seeing marginalized groups gaining access to be part of the storytelling as well. This is a great jump off point. I mean, there's a couple of points that you covered. So for example, I was in that exposure studio program, and we had some great speakers, and this theme came up, and we did get a bit of a terse answer. So the theme, two of the speakers were very interested. They're both Black. They're both from England. One is, I think, England, Montreal. I can't remember if he's originally from Toronto, but he was in Montreal when he gave the talk. And they talk about the colonial lens and about, I guess, roughly whitewashing, but these ideas of where these perspectives come from and who's allowed to tell the story and, who builds that narrative. I did an interview with Twinkle Banerjee, and she's from India, and she talked about how, the projection of what India's like has become so polarized because we think of everybody starving there, or with Bollywood that everybody's rich and driving Lamborghinis. But the reality is it's another society. There's a middle class, there's people that are working every day. They have their own socioeconomic problems and their own culture, but It's frustrating for her coming from that country to see how, Europeans and North Americans view her through that lens. But, the counter argument, and I think this is what of course they're white, but, some of the counter argument is if the privileged people don't write those stories, who will? Who has the access to the media? So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, what is as someone who works in this field, how do you make a delineation between, how do you balance your personal sense of morality or, I don't know, purpose to these problems?
I think that's a good question, and it's one that I'm like always trying to touch back on and wrestle with constantly. It's actually the main reason why I'm going into my master's program, is to struggle with these ethical questions, because I am a white cis male photographer, and there's like a billion of us, and we're all going in and telling these stories. And whenever you see a lot of documentary photography, or really good documentary photography, it's by people who look like me and from my cultural group, more or less. I mean, we're not a monolith, we're not all the same, but still it's from, mostly from Western white men. And so like I've done projects where I'm like, I really like what George Weber is doing. I'm going to try some of that myself. And, I have the background for it. I can definitely do it. And you make a lot of mistakes, and mistakes are okay, but not when you're causing damage. Luckily, like when I did a small short-term, well, it's kind of like ongoing, but a project with a mountain Métis community up in northern Alberta in Grand Cache. And for the main story was really simple. Like I just visited a few people, took some photos, and did a story in a Canadian Rockies annual about Métis businesses, basically using essentially privilege to be like, look here, here's how you can contribute, and like their businesses are the lifeblood of that community. So I think if you're using it to give back, but then I also attended a round dance for the community, and I thought I did my research. I went and talked to all the cultural contacts. I did like everything you're supposed to do. Made friends with a local videographer who's now a reporter for APTN. And I posted some stuff on Instagram. I gave all my photos to the community to be like, use these however. These are for you. These are of you. This is, what I saw from the community. But when I was posting on Instagram, I wasn't specific enough about who was in the photos of the cultural groups. Like I thought I was specific enough and I knew what I meant to say, but I got a call from, her name is Shayla Leonard. She's a wonderful human being and an amazing journalist. If anybody's listening, go follow her, please. She's wonderful. But she was really nice about it. And, she's under no obligation to check me, but she did. And she was like, look, like when you're reporting in this community, like there's a lot of identity politics. You need to be very, very, very specific, to the point of like, I know this, everybody knows this. No, you need to be very specific about who is in your photos and who you're talking to. You need to like almost over report and get way too much information and then, put that out there like as much as you would think you need. And I was like, whew, and I thought I had done everything right, but I still managed to fuck up. It wasn't bad, and it didn't like cause a whole lot of damage or anything. And I think I caught it right before anybody saw it except for Shayla, of course. But, it still could have damaged my rep within the community, and also could have, by association, made them less open to telling their stories to other cultures, right? And that can like damage the cultural bridges that we're always trying to build. So I think like we're all learning, and it's tough because you want to do this stuff, but sometimes I even wrestle with the fact like, should I even be doing this? Like, why am I doing this? Like, and you're right, like a lot of times what we're seeing is, we have the privilege to be able to do these things and tell the stories. It's really important for the community to be able to tell their stories, but they often don't. And who will tell the stories if we don't? But at the same time, you want those communities to be able to tell their own stories. So finding a balance between that is really tough. I'm just trying to be out there and do as little damage as possible and try to inform the world. But, you can't always get it right.
I mean, the word right is interesting. I always end up devolving everything into semantics, but like it's a funny thing, right? Like I mean, even the first thought I had was like, speaking of George Weber or older journalists, or sort of the bygone era of like the classics. That was a generation, I think, where people were a lot less sensitive. Just on the topical side, I don't know if that's personally true. But I feel like 20 years ago, you get less pushback trying to show a ceremonial process because you didn't name the specific people involved, because they just needed some representation. But now it feels like everything is so tense, like not even just minority groups, but even communicating on Twitter. It becomes so quickly into, I mean, I'm old, so I call them flame wars still, but like there's just so much tension, right?
That's like
it's a lot of yelling at
round
each other.
one terminology.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how long you've been in the game, but you've studied this. So do you think that there's almost a block in communicating information through photography now? Or is it just part of the natural evolution of how to tell stories? Because this tension is pervading. The more people particularly talking street photography, the more people don't want to do street photography anymore, except people that just like take snapshots of random folks and just post them on their Instagram. Pushing that trend aside, narrative street photographers seem to be a lot more tense and worried, and at least in my small circle. Do you think that's just how it's always been, or is there something changing in the world of photography?
Yes, both. The answer is yes. I think a lot of that is that like a lot of new people are discovering street photography, right? So you got a lot of imposter syndrome, and with that comes, people, especially in the current climate, that are, we're all very sensitive about each other's cultural boundaries. So naturally, people are going to be more reticent to take on work where they don't think they can do it justice. So that's one thing. But also this kind of mirrors like the evolution of ethnography and anthropology and academia too. Like you're not going to see another like Nanook of the North in a documentary again, and good, because terrible, just complete misrepresentation of a culture for the most part. And so things like that, like how much do we interact with things as anthropologists? Do we, to be tainted? Like we're coming at it from a very privileged eye. So a lot of self-examination in academia, it sort of like filters down a little bit to the culture, but there's also a lot of cultural social justice movements that have been helping that out. Those are driving a lot of the forces behind what's in popular media and photography as well. So I think photography still does have its place there, but I'm going to relate a lot of these things back to work with, reconciliation and post-colonial stuff, because that's kind of where I'm headed right now, or at least have experienced in the most recent history of my work. Basically, what is happening right now is there's a problem, basically a consultancy problem with documentaries, especially ones that are initiated by non-Indigenous people about Indigenous people, where a lot of times Indigenous people feel like they're just kind of consultants in their own story, but never actually telling their own stories themselves. And so there's this pervading idea that's growing that, you should be able to tell your own stories. And there's been enough of external sources telling stories about the communities. And I think that is making people very reluctant to get into territory that they might seem divisive or might paint them in a bad light. And this is good and bad in that it's good that we should all really be self-examining, and also being able to, help with these reconciliation processes to empower communities to tell their own stories, because obviously there is benefit in having an external eye to a story, and that comes with a lot of things. For example, there was a Singaporean photography I think she's part of Magnum, Sim Chi Yin. She's a Chinese photographer. Well, she's from Singapore, and she did a series of photographs in Beijing called The Rat Tribe, where she photographed people living in the basements of Beijing apartments. Like, you see them on the street, they just look like 20-somethings, right? Like pretty trendy. But they live in like terrible squalor because they can't afford rental prices, and they're feeling the squeeze there too. One could argue that those people form their own subculture. So, is it ethical for her to have gone there and done that? Probably, because they're from her own nation, like they're of her nationality. She's, the same. But I think that kind of translates into a lot of people's street photography now too, where, things like homelessness, unhoused people on low income brackets, you're out there making these photographs, but sometimes it can feel like you're taking photographs, like taking something from people. And I think that fear is legitimate too, because at the end of the day, I think George is right. Like, why are you taking these photos? Is it for you? Are you trying to make a social impact? Photography, when used properly, is a really powerful tool for social change. At least historically it has been, and even in recent histories. Look at the World Press Photo Awards. Always see like photos that have gone viral. Even during the pandemic in Alberta, there's a photographer in Calgary or Edmonton. She photographed somebody who's, like that doctor with their head in their hands after just telling somebody that their family had passed away. So it's a powerful tool for social change. I just think that people are getting it. I think they're maybe realizing how important and how powerful it can be. So people are getting really reluctant now to put their voice out there because it does have power. And if you do mess up, it can have profound impacts.
Like, why are you a photojournalist? Like, how did you get into it in formal training? Because so much of modern myth making is about these, like intuitive savants that just end up somewhere and they're building art. But, there's a focus here because you've studied it. So
I came out of the womb with a Leica, and ever since then, I've been snapping away. I was my genetically engineered to click shutters.
Born for this.
I was born for this. Yeah. Oh man, that's kind of a long story. I feel like I'm at the point in my career. I feel like I've been at this point for a while where I tie being a journalist so intimately with my personality and my perception of self that I don't know if I could ever change it now. I'm 31 now, and my 20s was like really like a part of that exploration of being like, but even then I kind of was like, I can't really do anything else. I don't want to do anything else. And every time I kind of tried to stray out of that, I would kind of do it okay for a little while. And then I would just try to convince myself that I liked doing other things, and just my psyche eventually was like, no, like, you're not doing this anymore. Go back to the thing before. And then I was happier. So I started journalism school when I was like 18. And before then, like in high school, like the Edmonton, like I grew up in Edmonton. So the Edmonton Journal had this like program where you could write for the paper as, like a high schooler. And I was like, this is so cool. Like, I get to go out and talk to people. I'm an extreme extrovert. So I love meeting new people. That's like my reason to be, is to meet and talk to new people and like learn about them. And I love that. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to keep this to myself. Why don't I just broadcast it to other people? And then even before that, like I was the kid who was always like making movies on crappy mini DV cameras in like junior high. Like if there was a video project or a photo project or any way to turn like a social studies paper into a multimedia thing, I would do it. And I had a lot of fun doing it. So it kind of like naturally just kind of led to itself. And even in 2008, when I went into J school, like the future of media was really rocky. And it hasn't changed really. In terms of its uncertainty, things have changed about it. There wasn't any real social media back then per se. Like I think Facebook had just launched in Canada like 2 years before that. So I kind of got into it in earnest when I was 18 and went to 2 years of at MacEwan, and then I loved it so much that I was like, okay, I'm going to go get my full degree. Went to Mount Royal, and it took forever to finish because mental health issues, and also having to write and work while at the same time as going to school. So it was a slog, but I was really proud to have finished it. And now I've been freelancing ever since and going back to school for something that's essentially going to, help round that out even more. So I've been doing this for a little while and been pretty much obsessed for the whole time. And I love to keep up on like the studies of things too. Like if there's like new media studies, I'm all over that, and new studies about like do a documentary in groups about your own cultures. I think that also, I could have gone into like just like local news and stuff, but I kind of really wanted, I was more attracted to the longer term stories, things that have more of a social impact because the way that news is now, they don't really, like, unless you're working for a really big outlet like the New York Times. In Canada, there's barely any of them that really do this anymore, where if your staff, like, forget about it, you're not going to do a long-term project, but you can pitch them and get paid substantially less. So I kind of was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to make peace with the fact that I'm probably always going to operate at a loss for the rest of my life, but this is something I need to do. I really need to tell stories. And a lot of this is like me trying to fit that into my worldview and struggling to wrestle with that. So I've been trying this for, over 10 years now, which is not as long as some of the other guests that you've had, but I'm doing my best.
So you have a natural inclination for storytelling and investigatory journalism, but that's like that old 80s term, but like wanting to understand perspectives and where people are coming from, When you get into school, and this is a little bit unfair because you went to a specific school in a specific city with a specific culture, but
Yeah.
What are they teaching you when you study journalism? I mean, there's going to be classmates or people, alumni, that are going to split into both different sort of political polarities, but also different types and forms and levels of so-called journalism, because that's a pretty broad concept. Is there something in the education that's like talking about reality formation, or is it mostly like technical aspects of how to get published and how to build projects at its core? Because from a, I don't know what the right metaphysical sense, photography itself has this positive and negative ability to tell people what they think ought to be real, and journalism in particular is a powerful tool to shape public opinion. So are you trained to be aware of that? Or is this something that your own personal moral compass has to dictate as you become a professional? Because I don't think I could do what you do. I don't think I was designed to, because I certainly didn't do projects, talking to people on the street. I was too busy being angry at myself. So, what is that like to learn it as a craft?
Well, I think every journalism school is different. I'm sure you get a different experience if you're going to Ryerson or Carleton or UBC. I think they have a program, or UVic, one of the two, or Mount Royal, or even MacEwan. When I did MacEwan for 2 years, it was just a diploma. So it was mostly focused on technical aspects, heavily involved with writing and literature and legal matters. So that didn't really give you like a big background into any of the metaphysics or the philosophy of truth or of fact or of essentially exploring. I mean, they kind of taught you try to be fair and balanced, try to check for sources, those kinds of things. So those are good foundational aspects to journalism. But when I went to Mount Royal does a great job of kind of rounding out the education. So they took a lot of what I had learned. I got lots of credit for it eventually. It took me a while to get the credit for some reason. My transcripts got lost in the mail. I don't know what to tell you. But what they do is, I took anthropology classes. I took classes on international community development. I took a lot of introductory philosophy and communication theory as well. Communication theory. Oh my God, I hope my communication theory prof isn't listening to this, because I didn't really do very well in those classes. Not because I didn't understand the concepts, but because I was just going through a lot. So Maria, if you're listening, I'm sorry. But those ones were really profound. You go over, Roland Barthes, Camera Lucidia, the death of the author. Descartes is important because, one of his kind of thought experiments was, don't trust your senses. How do you know that you exist, right? Well, I think, therefore I exist. That's the proof. But it, kind of goes above, more above that, where okay, well, what is your perceptions of the things going on around you? How do you know they're real? Those types of things are gone into heavily. And I always found those really fascinating because recently I also came up on this study that, because I was I gotta get a new camera, but do I really need slow motion if I'm doing documentary? And there was a study that kind of sucked me all the way back in my thoughts, basically to my undergrad days, where it was talking about how using slow motion in video can alter perceptions of an audience based on what they're seeing. And, that's straight up Descartes and Roland Barthes, where it's the death of the author, regardless of what you're intending to come across, things will come across to an audience differently for everybody, because everybody decodes things differently based on their own culture, based on their own things. So the camera is an extension of our senses, right? So it can record the facts of what's going on, or at least one fact within a 35 millimeter frame or whatever format you're using. Does that represent the truth of what's happening? Because, you're showing up at that split second, but there was a whole bunch of seconds before that, and there's going to be a whole bunch of seconds after that. So you're trying to tell your perception and illustrate something based on one frame. So it's tricky, right? Because all these things can be altered for using propaganda. I think that there is, you also have to start off with the impression that there is a universal truth to something that you're trying to represent, which that is also subject to a lot of debate. And, everybody can look at a body of facts and then interpret a truth from it differently. You see that with a lot of this is very similar to the debates they have in science, right? Look at the climate change debate. People can look at an abundance of facts and say, okay, climate change is real. All the scientists agree with it. But then there's a slice of people who, for whatever reason, look at those facts and come to a different conclusion or just reject them altogether, right? So it's tricky to be able to find ways to decode that and represent the truth of what's going on, because really, if you're out there taking a photo and you can think that a perfect representation of a situation, someone somewhere will take issue with that or completely come to a different conclusion that what you had intended, or, like, oh, I was there, this is what I saw. Being a journalist is a huge responsibility, and that society kind of endows us with this trust to say, you are trained. You are trained to use your senses and extensions of your senses in reporting media to be able to go to a place, to go to an event, and come away with some semblance of truth. So this is collective facts, test hypotheses. So really, it's very scientific, or at least it should be, to kind of go there and try to do that. But because it's a social science, things are tricky. We don't always get it right, and maybe we can't represent the truth all the time, but we do our best. And what other methods have we got to do so? And then even if you do represent it perfectly, it can be taken by other people and twisted and warped into their own narrative. So it really doesn't matter. And that was kind of the thesis of Death of the Author by Roland Barthes, is essentially, it doesn't matter what the author doesn't matter, really. It's what the interpretation is of those things. And that was always a powerful concept to me, where I was like, hey, no matter how good of a job that I do, everybody's going to interpret these things differently. Even if there is a universal truth that I'm representing perfectly, someone will decode that differently. And those things are important aspects that I think are part of a journalistic education. I think that even if you don't go to journalism school, you should be familiar with those concepts, because they're important to be able to, tell your stories.
And I remember I did a philosophy and religion course, and I wrote an essay to a Catholic professor trying to disprove a Catholic notion of God. Needless to say, I didn't do well in that course. But
it's funny because we're Good Friday right now, so what perfect time to talk about it.
It's true. I mean, there's a grander sort of topic about photography in general and its relationship to reality, but just to sit on religion a little bit, I think it reveals one thing for me, which is that this concept of, let's say, faith, culture becomes entwined with my interpretation of reality. So I talked to my friend who's a professor of divinity, and we were talking about iconography and the use of images, even before, obviously, photography is involved, and how it kind of shapes and can be shaped to support. It could be now in reflection bias, or it could be a control mechanism. It can be like a million different things. And I think in hindsight, they tend to be interpreted negatively. Photography in particular is a strange thing. So, I don't know. I think this is my problem. I can't get away from photography's power to alter and distort reality. When you pick up a camera and you take some snapshots, it feels very benign, right? Because it's for me. So I go out, I'm playing with this toy, I take a picture. I'm not thinking that the lens is a separate eye, and that, its perspective of capturing light is different than what I perceive. Never mind interpret with my brain and my culture, never mind putting it out into the world and having someone else tell me that I fucked it up. But it starts to evolve, and it starts to pick up all of this meaning, really. And I don't understand personally how to deal with that. Journalism is a strange thing. I mean, I remember reading some of the Magnum stuff, talking about sending war photographs back to the States, but the editor chooses what photograph to use with what narrative, and the photographers are usually upset because they're like, that is not what I saw. That is not the picture that I like. I mean, what do you think about how photography is being used? Not just in journalism. I mean, that kind of puts you in this bit of a pigeonhole, but as a photographer in general, it sounds like it bothers you like a little bit, that it has some power of altering people's, I guess, opinions, or I don't know how to phrase it actually, but yeah, like, what do you think your relationship with the status of photography in general is?
That's a good question. I mean, as a journalist, I do like that photography has power to alter people's opinions. And I mean, if you see something like societal injustice going on, that's a really powerful tool to enact change and to also tell the truth about an event or about something that's happening. But also, I think it's important to realize that photography doesn't operate, like each photographer doesn't operate in a vacuum. Like if you're covering a war, like you kind of put that there, it's important that there are many different photographers there too, right? Like because each person really has their own inherent biases. This kind of goes back to like day one journalism stuff. Like everybody, like how do you interact with your own bias? Because every person has a political leaning or religious affiliation or not religious affiliation, like a background of their own. So whenever you pick up that camera, your entire self and the culmination of who you've ever been to that point is now also being filtered through the lens. And that can have profound impacts to change other people's ideas, right? So a good recent example of this is the way that the White House insurrection was recorded. There were at least like 3 or 4, 7 photographers. There are 7 being the photo agency, as well as a bunch of other news media. But if you look at the photos from that, some people were shooting it in black and white. Some people were shooting it in color. You get completely different interpretations of the same event. But that's okay because they were all there. And you have, like, between all of them, you kind of have, like, a large spread of data. So that's good. And then, you can kind of, like, glean some sort of like medium between all those things. I think that photography can also be warped to distort things, right? So that, for example, one of the ethical questions we were always posited in journalism school is, okay, you go out to a scene of like a murder or something and, or like an accident and there's like gore everywhere. Like this is the truth of the scene. There's just body parts. I've been in this situation in Mexico City when I covered, I was there during my honeymoon, actually, and I ended up photographing during the earthquake. But there was a lot of carnage. Like, do you photograph that? If you do photograph that, is it ethical to publish that? Putting that on the front page of a then newspaper, like on a newsstand where people walking down the streets. I mean, this is kind of quaint now because newsstands, like, is basically like, okay, like, what if you were to put them on the front page of the Calgary Herald's website where somebody's like, eating their Cheerios in the morning, they're scrolling down and suddenly like, boom, there's a decapitated body. And it's like, whoa, do you put that there? I mean, it does represent the truth of what happened, but do you do that, right? A good example of that would be the photograph of a person jumping to their deaths outside the World Trade Center on 9/11. That was like gone over. I can't remember if that was New York Times or not. I think it probably was, but that was like thrown around apparently like for a long time. Whether or not to even publish that photo or even to show that. The photographer was like, ooh, like, do we show this? I think it was published. They got a lot of complaints. So even if you cover a certain event, your selection of what to represent will alter people's perception of the reality. Because what if you didn't publish that, right? And you just published the thing like, oh, well, I didn't see anybody jumping off the buildings, but suddenly seeing that makes the entire situation seem like you connect with that one person, that individual story. Imagine what it'd be like to jump to your own death. That is an instant connection that I think anybody who's even like remotely, has a sense of self can instantly connect with and be horrified about. So that would change someone's perception. I think that's a powerful thing. I think that's a good way to represent events. But also that can be taken the other way and warped and completely be used to misrepresent an event that, where something, I don't have a good example of this that I can think of off the top of my head, but if, to make someone seem more active in an arrest, say, for example. But yeah, a good example actually would be, well, not a specific one, but the slow motion study that I referenced before, they were using some slow motion tapes for a trial of an arrest. And the perception of the jury as to the level of participation of the person who was being arrested, when it was slowed down, he seemed to be more of an aggressive presence rather than when it was played at full speed, it seemed like the police were aggressive. And the reality was that the police were in the wrong there. But you can change things to distort reality. And it really is a double-edged sword. There's no good or bad to it, really, inherently. There's good and bad to it. So I don't have any firm stances on this because there's just it's such a complicated question.
The second message is from Park Power. Park Power is your friendly local utilities provider here in Alberta. They offer internet, electricity, and natural gas with low rates, awesome service, and profit sharing with local charities. Here in Alberta, you get to choose who you buy your internet, electricity, and natural gas from. Park Power has low overhead, which in turn allows them to offer low competitive rates. Reach out for a no obligations comparison by emailing estimates@parkpower.ca. If you decide to switch, it's easy. It's really just a change to your billing, and you can feel good knowing you are helping to give back to our communities with your utility bills. Learn more at parkpower.ca. Okay, so what have I learned? I've learned of the concept of the colonial lens. We've heard that before, which is the inherent bias formed when our media is filtered through an empowered storytelling class. Traditionally for us here in North America, that's an upper middle class white male story. But I've also learned that we're all becoming acutely aware of this, and opportunities are arising for each of us to share our own unique points of view. The drive for journalism shouldn't be to silence anyone, including the establishment. Rather, it's imperative that we take advantage of the digital media process to get even more stories out and in front of as many people as we can. There's a drawback, of course, oversaturation, disenchantment, and of course, the echo chambers. But there's a gain also. We might actually be able to develop the balanced opinions, ones that might help us learn to critically assess information. But where does that leave us? We can become overwhelmed with that sense of imposter syndrome or the futility of having to stand out in such a large sea of content. But it shouldn't take away the importance of sharing our experiences. On the contrary, it's probably more imperative that we each keep pursuing our own interests and passions. I think the key is to just take away the personal and short-sighted gains, commit instead to a grander cause of being part of a collective amassment of experiences that, in its totality, could make up culture itself. A single picture, on its own, has lost a lot of its staying power, but a collection of images still tells a story, and a collection of stories can still become a body of work, a potentially impactful one, perhaps even a necessary one. So let's get out there and keep developing our stories to add to this grander project, this, what did they used to call them? Encyclopedia of cultural experiences? Remember those? Oh man, I really